Curtis Chambers, Certified Financial Planner with the Chambers Financial Group. The number one question I'm getting right now is, are we going to have another Great Depression? It's a relevant question. The IMF on April 14th projected global growth to fall 3% in 2020 and forecast the Great Lockdown to be the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression and far worse than the global financial crisis. Gita Gopinath, director of the IMF's research department, writes, "The magnitude and speed of collapse in activity following necessary quarantines and social distancing policies implemented by countries around the world is unlike anything experienced in our lifetimes."
This is a crisis like no other, which means there is substantial uncertainty about the impact it will have on people's lives and livelihoods.
Wow. So is the stock market recovery we have recently experienced just a head fake before a long-term economic downturn like the Great Depression? Not in my view. An examination of what caused the Great Depression and the situation today shows some important differences. Let's take a quick look. The Great Depression was a worldwide economic downturn that began in 1929 and continued until 1939. It is notable not just for its severity, but also for its length, a decade, and it only ended due to the U.S. entry into World War II. At that point, though, America was astounded by its own industrial capacity. So how did the strongest economy in the world sit around in doldrums or much worse for 10 years? As Steve Frazier documents in his book, Every Man a Speculator, the economic cycle was present even before Wall Street from the time of the Mayflower, although back then they called it the boom and bust cycle. The booms would last 4 to 8 years, and the busts would last about a year or two. But a 10-year depression was something completely new. So how did it happen? Well, it starts with the Federal Reserve, which was new, having been first established in 1913. During the 20s, the U.S. and many other world governments followed an easy money monetary policy. That is, they kept the money supply high and interest rates low. This was an effort to spur the economy and employment after the ravages of World War I. This policy meant banks had lots of money to lend and consumers and businesses could easily borrow. This seemed to work for a while and helped create the so-called Roaring Twenties. However, easy money policies often lead to speculative bubbles, like, for example, what happened to real estate in 2008. But back in the 20s, individual investors were for the first time becoming interested in the stock market. The market was on fire, and it increased sixfold from 1921 to 1929. And amazingly, at that time, the margin rate to borrow to purchase stocks was only 10%. This is a process where the buyer pays as little as 10% of the purchase price of a stock and borrowed the rest from a broker. Speculation became rampant. Individual investors were in the market and with borrowed money. The Fed became concerned about the frothy stock market and excesses and raised interest rates starting in 1929. On March 25, 1929, the Fed warned about excessive speculation, and the crash began on Thursday, October 24th. There are many theories about causes of the Great Depression, but there is a consensus. The Fed should have cut short the process of monetary deflation and banking collapse. Instead, the Fed raised rates and deliberately reduced the money supply. The Fed allowed many banks to fail, and 1/3 of all banks vanished, including large public banks like the New York Bank of the United States. This created even more panic, and with less money to go around, the monetary base continued to contract to about 35%. This is deflation. There were other complicating factors. The U.S. was still in the gold standard back in the 30s, which limited the Fed's options. Next, in 1931, the Fed enacted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. This was a global tariff intended to protect U.S. farmers during the downturn, but the problem was other countries reciprocated, and now global trading ground to a halt. The U.S. also raised taxes with the Revenue Act of 1932. This raised the top income tax rate from 25% to 63%. Rates were again raised with the Revenue Act of 1935. It's almost as though the Fed realized they'd stimulated the economy too much during the 20s, and so they became overly restrictive during the 30s. But don't take my word on this. In the words of Ben Bernanke, former Federal Reserve Chair, I would like to say to Milton and Anna regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. Ben S. Bernanke. If we think of the economy as a campfire, raising interest rates, contracting the money supply, and increasing taxes are like dousing water on the fire. This has a place when the economy is going too strong and in danger of overheating, but not when the economy is in a state of collapse like the 1930s. When the economy is struggling, it is generally recognized that the opposite is called for. Now let's fast forward to the Great Lockdown of 2020, as the IMF calls it, and compare how the Fed and the U.S. government have reacted. First, rather than raising interest rates, the Fed lowered interest rates. On March 16th, early in the crisis, the Fed cut interest rates to zero. Second, rather than letting the money supply collapse, the Fed increased the monetary base through a variety of credit and lending programs, putting more than $6 trillion into the economy. Third, the FDIC program is there today to help protect banks, although they can still fail. But since the coronavirus, only 2 U.S. banks have failed, and the majority of banks appear sound and have good liquidity positions. Next, the U.S. has not implemented a policy of large global tariffs, although there are some isolated tariff rifts, especially, of course, with China. And finally, rather than raising taxes, the U.S. government has implemented a $2 trillion stimulus economic relief package. Although not technically a tax cut, its effect is similar. Today, in the case of the Great Lockdown, at this time of economic crisis, the Fed and the U.S. government monetary and fiscal actions have worked to stimulate the economy rather than stifle it. For this reason, I do not see the current situation as analogous or comparable to the Depression years. In fact, this quick monetary and fiscal stimulus is no doubt one reason for the rapid economic and market recovery we're experiencing. A final thought. The worst pandemic in modern history was the Spanish flu of 1917. This pandemic was followed not by a depression, but by the Roaring '20s. If you would like to discuss the current economy, please give me a call or set up a Zoom conference with me online. We're not in it for the short run, not even till the Fed changes its policies. We're in it for the long term.